Okay. So today's topic is all about web programming, and so essentially the reason why I want to teach that is because I want to teach you at least one approach how you can program graphical user interfaces in Python. So essentially the idea is you've written your script, it has evolved, it has become more robust, and now it becomes maybe useful for more people, and you want to share it and you want to make it easy to use for other people. And so one way you can do that is to implement a graphical user interface for your Python application. So there's obviously many different ways on how you can do that. One kind of traditional approach is to write a desktop application that works on Windows and Mac and Linux. And there are some various different libraries that you can use to do that. Two that I want to mention here is PyQt and VxWidget. So if you're interested in implementing a desktop application, then you might want to look into these libraries. But instead, in this class, I decided to do web programming, and there's a bunch of advantages why you might want to use a web application. So first of all, you can make your application available to everyone who has a web browser. So independent on the device he or she is using or the operating system they're using. You also don't, once you've installed this web server, the user doesn't need to install anything, right? He or she can just go to a web URL and then start using your application. Yeah, so in order to be able to do web programming, I need to teach you the fundamentals of the web. And the most important part that we need to learn is the language that is used to represent web pages. And that's the so-called hypertext markup language. And so essentially any web page that you're visiting is written in this HTML format. It's maybe a little bit similar to LaTeX, right? That you write the content and you write how the content should be displayed, and then the web browser interprets that file and renders it in the way that that it looks pleasant for a user. Now there's the current version is the HTML5 version, which is most used by most modern web browsers, and which I'm also going to show you here now. So in general, with the web, there's loads and loads of online resources. So for most of these things, I just show you the very basics, but you basically find everything online that you need. So a simple web document is nothing else but a text file. I've shown you one here. And this is almost kind of the smallest HTML document that you can find. You can see it contains of a bunch of lines. Most of them are markup lines, so they're just telling the web browser what it is all about. And then there's also some content here. And so essentially, if you read this carefully, you can see that there's an HTML tag here. There's so-called tags. So they mark the part of where the HTML is actually contained. Then we have some header lines here, including a title. So this title is the text that shows on the top of the web browser if you open the website. And then you have the body part down here. This contains the actual content of the website. So in this case, it's a paragraph, which is marked by this P here, and then the content is just hello world. So if you save this file, for example, as index.html or any file.html, you can open it with your web browser, and then you will see the content. So I'm not sure if I think I might actually, we can try this here. So if I type in Firefox index.html and open Firefox, there we go. So this is my little web page. It just says hello world, and here on the top, on the title, you see this is a title. So and essentially, this is how the entire web, whenever you see a web page, it's nothing else but such a long document that is rendered by the browser in a nice way. Okay, so I'll just teach you some of the basics of HTML. So if you want to use comments, you need to include them with this strange bracket, exclamation mark, minus, minus, and then comes the text, the actual comment, and this is how you end the comment. So just look it up when you need it. So then we have then we can have different headers. So the biggest header is called H1. So that you always use this tag here to start a header, and then use exactly the same tag but with a slash to indicate that the header is over. And then if you want to have the subheading, then you just use H2 and so on. So if I render this, this is how it looks like. So you have a large text on a header, and then a smaller text on a subheader. Then we have new lines. New lines are this bracket BR. And so essentially, if you use that, then it's being rendered as a new line. If you don't include this, but you include a new line in the text, it will actually ignore it. Right? So you need to hard code new lines as part of the HTML format. Otherwise, you don't see new lines. Then we have special characters. So again, typically you can't just write any characters in an HTML format. Instead, you need to use so-called HTML entities. So, for example, if you want to use any of the Norwegian symbols, instead of typing in the symbol in the HTML file, you just type in this HTML equivalent code. So here's an example of a Norwegian name with these codes used. And then if I render it, you can see that it's Boss insert renderlag. Then we have paragraphs. So paragraphs is just a normal text paragraph, and they are marked with these P tags. And you can see that the web browser renders them as text with some gap in between. And so this might actually differ from web browser to web browser. So Firefox might display this slightly differently than a Google Chrome browser. It might differ again rendered slightly differently than on a mobile phone. And then we can change how a text should look like. So I can make it bold by using this B statement. I can make it italic by using the I tag, and I can emphasize it using the EM tag. And I can also add links using the A tag. So here, this line down here will create a link with the text, this is a link. And if I click on it, it will go to the web page github.com. So you can see if I render this, down here you have the bold, the italic, and the emphasized text. And then down here is a link. And if you look closely, here, if I will click on it, I will get GitHub. Then we can render tables. So this looks a bit messy, but it's essentially just the table tag that indicates that a new table starts. Then we have the TR tag for each new row. And then the TH or the TD tags to indicate a new cell in each column. So what this will give you is a table with, you can see there are three rows here because there are three closing TR. This is the first row, this is the second row, this is the last row, and each row contains 3 columns. This is the first column, and I use the TH here to indicate that it's a header column, while for the other ones I use TD tags to indicate that these are normal cells. This is how it looks like. And so you can see that the header columns was automatically by the browser rendered in bold. Yeah. Then we can include some images. So here's I use the image tag. I need to specify where the image is. So I specify the path to the image. I can also specify an alternative text in case the image is not available, and then some additional text. So this is Duras rhinoceros, if you know this picture. And then finally, we can also style, we can tune the text more precisely if we want. So there's these so-called attributes that we can add to any HTML tag. So for example, if we have a paragraph, or if we have, for any tag, we can add these style attributes, and they can be used to fine-tune how the content should be visualized. So for example, you might want to change, so valid property, so the way it works is that you have style equals, and then here you have the properties as text, and there's always the property name, and then the value of the property. And you can have multiple properties in such a way. And so some valid property options that you might want to use is the width of the tag, the height, the color, the background color, family of the font, the size, and the alignment. So to give you an example, here the image before was shown very, very large. So if I want to change the size of it, I can use the style attribute and set the width property to 100 pixels. So if I render this now, you see now it's the same image, but it's rendered much, much smaller, so that it's only 100 pixels wide. And the same thing also works for paragraphs. Let's say I want to make a paragraph where the text color is blue, and the background color is specified here with this red, green, blue. So then I get something like this. Okay, and so essentially this is how the web works, right? It's just text files with these HTML statements, and then our web browser renders them and displays them in a nice way. But so far, the interaction was very little, right? So so far these are just static documents, and they're just being displayed in a nice way. But the web is more. The web also allows us to enter content. I can enter as a user. I can enter content and send it to the web browser, which then is being processed, and an updated version is maybe sent back to me. So HTML also has some features for user-specific content, where the user can add, can write in content, and maybe can click buttons and so on. And of course, this is very important if you want to implement an application in Python. And so, whenever we want to get content from the user, we're going to use HTML forms. So HTML forms is a special tag, as you can see. They always start with form and then end with the slash form. And then whatever goes in here is building blocks that allow for user input. And so here are some examples for user input that we can use. There's text input. So I can, well, that just disappeared. Sorry. Not sure what happened here. Okay, but I guide you through it. So there's text, there's an input box where I can enter in text, where I can enter text in, and then, so for example, maybe you want to ask for a user login or password, so you can use that. And you can see the way I get this is I create a new form, and then I use the so-called input tag, where I say type is equals text, and then I use a unique identifier, because later on I want to be able to access that data. I want to be able to refer to that specific text box again, so I give it a specific name that I can reference it later again. So this is how you create a text box. You can also change the type here. So if you be careful here. So if you type it with text, then then the web browser assumes that it's normal text box. But let's say I want to ask for a password, then it's not a good idea to immediately show the content of the text box. So then I can set the type to password, and now if I type in, you can see that the web browser automatically hides the text. So a bit more realistic use case. So here we have a form that contains of 3 text boxes. First we have the name with an input text, then we have the last name with a normal input text, and then we have a password where I set the type to password so that you can't see it. And so each of them I gave different names so that later on I can differentiate between these different text boxes again. So here you can see it, and I can type in a password. Then we have radio inputs. So sometimes it's useful to have a select box like this. And again, in this case, you use input, and this you use type equals radio. And by doing that, the browser automatically renders such a radio button. And then finally, we need a submit button, so a button when it's pressed that the data is sent to the server. And these are so-called submit buttons. And it looks essentially the same, then that we have the button is just a type equals submit here. And then we can give it a value, and that value will be the text that is shown on the button. And so we also need to specify which action happens when we press on this button. And this is done here as attributes to the form tab. And so specifically, by adding this action tag here, you specify a URL, a web address, and the data, so all the content of that form will be sent to that specific URL when you click the button. So here's a case where I sent so this is a bit of a rigged example because I know that the Bing.com search engine expects an attribute Q, which is the content of the search keywords. And so by using it here as a text inbox and using the action, using Bing.com/search as the action, I can actually initiate a search on Bing.com using this form here. So I can type in hello world, and if I press submit, I will actually now get to Bing.com with the content that I've typed in now as a search keyword on Bing. Okay, so now we know essentially how content is being displayed on the web browser, and also how we can create forms that so that we can send data from the web browser to the web server. But the interesting part now is how do we actually implement a web server that creates these documents, these HTML documents, and that handles incoming data from these forms and works with them. And this is now the task of the web server, and this is the part where Python is important. And so essentially, a typical procedure when you ask for a website is the following. So as a user, you open your laptop and you type in the web address or the URL that you want to visit. And then as soon as you hit return, you make a so-called HTTP request to the web server. And it's this HTTP request that then is handled by the web server, and that web browser then creates the HTML page, typically on the fly. And so there's a program running on the web server that generates the HTML file and then sends it back through a so-called HTTP response. And this is then being sent to the web browser and rendered as an HTML file. So the key question now is how do we implement this web server that handles these requests? So there's essentially so the protocol that we're using, or the protocol that the web is based on, is the hypertext transfer protocol. And so this is what handles these incoming requests and the outgoing requests. And there's two important requests that we need to know of. It's the get request and the post request. And so essentially get is the default one. Get just requests data from a server. So if you type an URL to the web page and you press return, then you're sending a get request, meaning that you want to get the web page as an HTML page to your web browser. And then the post request, so this one is being used when you press the submit button on a form. So this is the one where you send data from your web browser to the client as a post request. So post requests are used to submit data to the server, and get requests are used to get data from the server to your client. I think I just skipped this. So we need to, so we could, of course, implement a web server ourselves and handle these get and post requests ourselves. But it's quite technical, and it's really not necessary because there's loads and loads of good packages out there. And the one that we are going to use is called Flask. So Flask is a Python package that essentially implements a web server for us. And it's a so-called micro web application framework. And the word micro simply means that it only comes with the minimum parts that you need to have a web server. So there's other alternatives that where you can build extremely complex websites, but to get started, it's much easier to have such a small framework where we can oversee the features relatively quickly. But nevertheless, Flask is also used in quite large companies. And so personally, you could use Flask to build static websites, for example, a blog or a private homepage, but also dynamic websites, for example, to build a graphical user interface for your application, but also some more technical things like an application programming interface server. Okay, so it's relatively, so the features of Flask is that it comes with a server included, so it's the programming interface, but also it comes with a web server included. So basically, essentially everything you need. It has some support for unit testing. It's open source, and it's really small in the sense that it doesn't come with any advanced features like database abstractions or form validation and stuff like that. So if you want to use more advanced things, then you either need to use additional modules, or you might want to switch to a different framework. Okay, installation is really easy. You just type in conda install Flask, and then you're done. Okay, let's look at the first example. So here's the Hello World, our very first web server written in Flask. So you see it's only about 8 lines of code. And essentially what's happening, so essentially we import the module, and then we have something that I'll explain in a second in more detail, and then we run the application. So I can now execute this, and you can see that I get a message down here saying running on my local computer on the port 5000. And this tells me that the web server is now running, and I can actually visit this website. So now I'm on this web URL 127.0.0.1.5000, and I get the answer hello world, which is exactly what the content that I've written in here. And you can also see that there's additional line got printed out here. So you can see that someone made a GET request on the URL /, which is exactly what I've done here. So you should have a slash here. But if I make more requests down here, you can see that for every single request, I get an additional line from the web server. So the web server handled the incoming request, generated the content, and the web browser showed them the content. So let's break this down. So in the first 2 lines, we import the Flask module, and we create a new instance, a new Flask instance, which I just call application. So this object here just represents our web server. And so then in the next 3 lines, here we need to specify to which URLs our web server should answer to. So when we have so you'll see, I give you more examples later on, but here we essentially specify the address, the URL, the web address that the server should respond to. And in this case, it is just slash, so it's just the default web address without anything after this URL up here. And so in this case, I define a function, and in that function, I implement what the web server should return, the content of that. So really, I should have typed in HTML code here, but I was lazy and I just typed in text here, and the web browser still displays it nicely. But I should have implemented HTML code here. And so then in the last 2 lines, I just call app.run, which then runs the application server. Okay, so there's one trick here, and it's sometimes useful to use when you call app.run, add the comment, add the parameter debug equals true. That's really useful when you do web server development. What it does is if you change the code, so you can, when you have your web server running and you change the code, then the web server will automatically update itself, and when you, so you don't need to kind of kill the web server and start it again once you did changes to your code. You can just have the web server running and continuously change code, and when you open the website, it's going to be, these changes will be immediately reflected. So if you have debug equals false, then the web server will kind of cache the code as it is, and code changes will not be reflected. So in that, if you don't have that flag, then you have to restart the server every single time you make code changes. There's another trick, and you can, if by default your web server only only accepts incoming requests from your own local machine. So other people in your network cannot access your web server out of security reasons. But in some cases, you actually might want to make it your web server public so that other people can use your web application as well. And the trick here is to use host equals 0000. And in that case, the web browser will just listen to any incoming request here and answer it. Okay, let's make our application a bit more interesting. So let's add let's say we want to make a web application that shows us all the users, or I should say a web endpoint, that shows us all the users in our system. So let's say we have a bunch of users here as a dictionary. Then I add a new app.route route. So remember, this app.route adds a new endpoint that I can visit later on. And then I implement the function that generates the content. And in so this case, I just go through all this dictionary, and here you can see I actually generate some HTML code using string manipulation. By the way, the name of this function that is specified here after the route doesn't really matter at all. This is just, you can name it whatever you want. The important part is this here. So now if I run this application, I can visit, I have one new web address that I can visit. It's now this localhost 5000/user. So this is the one that I've indicated up here. So if I visit this web page now, you can see it presents a web page where with our users on the title, and then I actually have the users that I had in my dictionary now as an HTML page. Okay, and so then we can also have parameterized URLs. So here, let's say I want to match any URL that starts with /user, and then any different anything afterwards, any text afterwards. And so this is a so-called parameterized URL, and this parameter here will be passed in as a as a parameter to the Python function, so I can make use of it later on in the function. So I can, for example, I could uppercase it, or I can check it against a password, and so on and so forth. So if I run this case now, I can visit web pages. So this is now /user/ and I can type anything in here. So I could type in Simon Funke, and I would then get greeted with user Simon Funke. So this is how you handle parameterized web addresses. Okay, so then finally, the last thing that we need to know for normal web pages is templates. So the reason for templates, so when we return the content of an endpoint, ideally we should return HTML code. And so you can do that, right? I can just, in the login, for example, I could kind of have copy and paste huge amounts of HTML code in here. But you've already seen that HTML code is quite lengthy, so it's not really practical to have this huge amount of texts in your code. And for that reason, Flask comes with a templating engine, and it's basically just some function that replaces, where you have a template text file, and Flask can replace certain variables in the text file. So, for example, let's say I want to create an endpoint that shows me a blog post with a specific name, and that name here is passed in as a variable in the URL. Then instead of now returning kind of the HTML content as a string, I now call the function render template and provide a file name of the template called post.html. And this is a parameterized file. So this file specifically has the parameter name, whose value I pass in here. Now, if you look at that template file here, it's stored in /template/post.html. You can see that this is now essentially my normal HTML file, except that I have these placeholders. This variable here, name, is now a placeholder with these double curly brackets. So the template engine will automatically replace this placeholder with the actual value of that variable. And I can also have some logic. So I can make if statements. If the name exists, then display this, and otherwise display something else. So I can run this and see what happens. So if I visit the web page, /post/history of science, and so this matches, if you look up here, this matches this URL up here, so it's /post/name. So we can look at it, and it doesn't work. So that's interesting. Yeah, so that's supposed to work. Maybe it's probably yeah, I think this is a bit messy in the oh, there we go. There we go. Displaying blog post history of science. Okay, I think it's time for a break. Shall we start again in 15 minutes?